From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Columbia University President Minouche Shafik resigns after months of anger over her handling or non-handling of protesters on that Ivy League campus. But with the protest movement gearing back up for the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, are we looking at another turbulent fall? Also, the Republican and Democratic presidential tickets sign up for more debates. What should we expect? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kim Strassel, joined today by my wonderful colleagues, Minouche Shafik and Colin Levy. So Ms. Shafik's resignation now makes Columbia the fourth Ivy president to step down in just past 9 months. Penn President Liz McGill resigned in December, Harvard President Claudine Gay in January. Both of those followed quickly after a congressional hearing which they spoke and angered a lot of members of Congress, but also donors to their university. In May, the president of Cornell, Martha Pollack, unexpectedly resigned. She said it was entirely her own decision, but it did come amid controversy over Cornell's disciplinary actions against some pro-Palestinian students. So now we have this Columbia resignation, which it was somewhat unexpected because it's been quiet and there are only 3 weeks of school left. But there's a long history here, and in some ways the protests at Columbia were among the worst and most covered. Minouche, can you remind us of just what unfolded at that campus in the spring? And let me ask, are you surprised by this?
Well, I'm not surprised at all, and I don't think anybody should be, because Minouche Shafik was definitely guilty of several firing offenses in the way she handled the protests on Columbia's campus when they really reached a boiling point in the spring. You had a mixture of students and a lot of outside progressive agitators who convened on the campus and started to camp out for a period of several weeks. And this really reached a head around the time that Israel was preparing its invasion of the Rafah portion of the Gaza Strip. So there had been some protests after October 7th, but really when it reached a huge crescendo was at that point because people assumed that it was going to be a humanitarian catastrophe. Of course, that didn't end up being the case, but that's a digression. So you saw lots of students gathered on campus demanding that Columbia divest of any support from Israel and demanding generally that the Democratic Party renounce any support for Israel's campaign in Gaza. And these protests were not just demonstrations, but were actually quite violent. You had protesters encircling students, Jewish students, and harassing them. And at that point, there was a clear responsibility on the part of Minouche Shafik to call in the police to remove the agitators and allow students to actually go to class. Instead, she allowed them to stay to the point that they took over a building on campus, Hamilton Hall, occupied it, changed the name, and were there for at least a day before police were eventually called in to clear it. And so the fact that she clearly was coddling these students instead of enforcing the law and providing a safe atmosphere for students to be able to attend class, I think was something that warranted her removal in the first place. And probably over the past few months since then, she's been in conversations with the Board of Columbia about exactly when and how the transition would take place. But she embarrassed the school and endangered students by failing to act, and so it makes sense that she finally had to move on.
Yeah, Minouche, she, of course, presented this as entirely her own decision and that it came after months of her thinking deeply about her future in the university. But I agree with you, Minouche, that it seems to me that this was probably in the works for a while, especially I know there's been a lot of donor pushback. But something really fascinating here, if you read the coverage of this, we're hearing a lot of people say, well, if you look at the resignations of Gay and McGill, they were forced out because of their seeming justification of anti-Semitic behavior on their campuses, which they defended in a way by hiding behind their claim that everyone has a right to protest. And of course, they went to those hearings. They were strongly called out. There was a huge backlash to it. The Shafik resignation, I'm seeing this entirely different portrayal of it in the press, Colin, which I find fascinating. They're saying that she, in fact, was a victim, not of what Minouche says, but this is what happens to you do when you actually decide to take a strong moral stand and actually ask the police to come into the campus, and that the problems she all faced was because she took action against these radical protesters, and that the blowback from all of this is among the reasons that she felt her position there was no longer tenable. I mean, what do you make of that argument, and what kind of message does it send to other college administrators?
I think it's exactly the kind of message that Students for Justice in Palestine would like to send. You know, you'll recall back in the day that they also were threatening Minouche Shafik and saying that if she took any action, then they'd have her booted out of there too. So I think they'd like to see this as, well, all college presidents should be on notice. If you're going to bring in the police, then you also can be forced to resign. I don't think that's actually an accurate portrayal of what's happened here. I think it's a lot more complex than that. And I think this really is just a sign that the process of accountability is playing out. And we're probably going to see that happen in colleges as everyone gets back to campus. But I think what happened last year, really importantly, is that Columbia became a place where Jewish students and their families from afar felt unsafe. And also importantly, that the school really turned itself over to being a platform for squatters politics. And they prioritized that over the sense of community and academic excellence that most students sign up for. And that's certainly something that Minouche Shafik was responsible for, because she was the president and she was the one who failed to stop that from unfolding. And I think that's something that affects all students and all families who are considering sending their children to Columbia and Harvard and other Ivy League schools and public universities, where they're really investing in their children's future and hoping that they're going there to learn and be enriched, not be intimidated and harassed.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what this might mean for Chicago next week and the Democratic Convention, and for the fall when we get back to school, when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel. I am here with Colin Levy and Mene Ukwe-Barua, and we are talking about the resignation of Minouche Shafik from Columbia. So one thing I would note, it didn't get a lot of attention, but as she resigned this week, we are only 3 weeks away from campus beginning again. And bear in mind, Columbia was already gearing up for renewed protests in the fall. The university has announced a new color-coded system to guide its community on the level of risk on campus. It was recently set from green to orange, which is the second highest amount of risk. And they're already putting into place certain restrictions. For instance, only people with Columbia identification are going to be permitted to enter the central campus. In the past, that central campus had been open to the public. So I kind of wonder here a little bit too, whether or not she managed to limp the school through to a canceled graduation and the end of classes. But we were gearing up here for just a resumption, I think, of what was there. And I do think that brings us to the question of whether or not this summer was just a brief lull and what we are likely to see next week out of Chicago. There are reports there are going to be major demonstrations for 3 of the 4 days of the convention at least. This organization, Coalition to March on the DNC, it includes Black Lives Matter, Students for Justice in Palestine, apparently 150 groups at all. They are agitating for a lot of demands. I would note demands that go beyond just what's happening in Gaza. The GOP convention missed a lot of that. And I think it's interesting. It's because some of those protesters said, well, it's not worth even talking to Republicans about this. We know we have to go after Democrats if we want change. What do you expect to see happen there, Mene, next week? And, is the press going to try to ignore this? Can it? Will it be too big to ignore?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely going to be a big resumption of the protests and even riots in some cases, and that's all centered on the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I think that there are a lot of these left-wing agitators who are very pro-Palestinian, in very many cases pro-Hamas, who believe that having these types of demonstrations has succeeded in drawing attention to their cause. And they have a lot of credibility in making that claim, because you've seen Democratic politicians, beginning with Joe Biden, actually showing that they do have an ear on what these demonstrators are saying. Joe Biden was asked in an interview some months ago whether he understood what people meant when they called him genocidal and being a killer. And he said, yes, he understood it. right. He didn't necessarily own that mantle or say he was going all the way to renouncing Israel, but he did essentially say, I listened to these people, and he implied that they do have some impact on the policies of his administration, and that seems to continue under Kamala Harris. She was in an encounter with a protester at one of her rallies recently, and she mentioned that it was important to put aside those divisions because they need to beat Donald Trump. But the approach of Democrats has always been to keep these demonstrators at arm's length without doing or saying anything to offend them too much, because they know they're such an important part of their coalition. They know a lot of younger voters who they need to be able to win have these views. So I think that at the Democratic National Convention, there's going to be a big scene, hopefully nothing too violent or anything that spills over into the community at large. Democrats have essentially fostered these sorts of demonstrations by not responding to them in a way that shuts them down entirely and shows that people aren't going to be able to influence their policies.
I couldn't agree more. If you look at Joe Biden, it's fascinating. There was a lot of criticism. He was very slow to even come out and condemn the violence of some of these protests. And then even as his administration did, even when he did come out with a pretty clear statement, that was when they also began to simultaneously ramp up their criticism of Israel, their pressure for a ceasefire. They made that decision not to ship certain weapons. They've leveled some sanctions on Israeli groups and individuals. So they seem to be wanting to try to paper over this or have it both ways. Colin, you are a Chicago native. We're hearing lots of things. They're saying, well, we've got seasoned professionals in there. We're ready for this. Folks who know the Chicago terrain. But there have been continuing protests there. How confident are you of the law enforcement to actually handle this next week?
I think that's a tricky question, Kim. I'm going to go with moderately confident.
Mm-hmm.
I think, on the one hand, I think there has been a big effort to secure this. Obviously, they want everyone to be safe, and they don't want to embarrass the DNC or embarrass themselves as a city, obviously. But Chicago Police Department has also been very much on its back foot for the past few years. We have all sorts of policies here that have made it a little bit more difficult for police officers to engage, whether that's with criminals or just in terms of how they feel when they're approaching protesters. Obviously, the protesters will act of their own accord to try to shame the police in that space as well. So there's no question it's going to be complicated. The size of the protest is going to be really quite enormous. And some of them, I'm hearing, will be targeting specific events. I think there is one speaking event where an Israeli Jewish group will be speaking on a podium, and there's a huge counter-protest organized around the same time. I mean, these are tinderboxes, so there's always something to be aware of there. But, as you know, the protesters are coming to the DNC because they want to break the Democratic Party. And these are highly organized professional protesters. These are the same folks that took their show to the college campuses to try to get the students up and running, and now they're taking it to the DNC.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you that we need to remember that a lot of the people who are organizing this are professionals. This is what they do. And if you look at some of their websites right now, calling for people to show up at this, it's quite remarkable the level of training they're giving. And I certainly hope, I'm going to be cautiously optimistic with you, Colin, that the Chicago police know this, are aware, and can handle this situation. Minouche, a last question on this going forward. Does this resurrect a theme for Republicans, or potentially, given what unfolds next week? We're seeing a lot of talk among Republicans now about Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick, Tim Walz, and his own role in Minneapolis riots and meltdown back during the George Floyd moment, and making the argument that this is not a ticket able to handle this kind of situation as it comes and shouldn't be in charge, especially with crime being at the top of voter issues as they go out to campaign. How do you think this plays politically, not just in terms of how the Democrats handle their left, which is a key part of this? Can it paper over this? But what does it hand Republicans, and how could the look coming out of Chicago matter in this election?
I think that Democrats over the past few years have shown themselves unable and unwilling to tamp down on public disorder in a whole bunch of ways. Obviously, the summer riots after the killing of George Floyd in 2020 is paramount there. But these university protests are another example. And I think that the southern border of the United States is also something that fits in that same narrative. And I think that that is something that a lot of swing voters, moderate voters really worry about. And you have seen Republicans be able to make that pitch to voters in some recent elections. In the 2022 midterm elections, that was essentially the unifying message of a lot of Republican Senate and House candidates. And they were able to win a lot of competitive races by saying, we're going to be the party of public order. These Democrats in office are completely scared and inept when it comes to actually keeping you safe. And so I think that that will have a lot of purchase again in 2024. The question, of course, is whether Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are able to actually prosecute that argument. They've shown themselves to be very scattered in their attacks on the Harris-Walz campaign over the past couple of weeks and unable to actually highlight some of their inefficiencies and inabilities. And so we'll see whether they're able to focus on that and make it a highlight, especially if we do see a major eruption as is expected out of Chicago. But if they can do that, it's definitely one of the better and most compelling arguments they'll be able to make.